Welcome to the Ayrshire coast, southwest Scotland. Today a land of rolling green hills, commuter towns, endless golf courses and sandy beaches that, on a rare summer's day, still draw legions of sunseekers from the nearby cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh. But 500 years ago, this coastline was a tourist trap of a different kind.
Come back with us to the 15th century, to a lawless time of warring clans and blood feuds, and the time, so legend says, of a savage whose stark crimes are echoed in the nightmares of our culture to this very day.
This is the legend and the history of the cannibal Sawney Bean. Alexander Bean, to give him his proper name, is said to have been the son of an East Lothian ditch digger, a shiftless lad who, deciding that the hard labour of the family business was not for him, eloped at a young age with a woman known as Black Agnes Douglas. Some accounts paint Agnes as a passive figure, enthralled with Sawney's dangerous yet charismatic personality. Others paint her as a witch and a murderer in her own right before she ever set eyes on Sawney, even going as far to implicate her unnatural sexual and culinary desires as the original impetus for some of the horrors that followed. All agree, however, that the pair finally settled here, at Benane Head in what was then the Earldom of Carrick. Sawney turned first to robbery to provide for himself, his lover, and soon his young family. As a highwayman, he would have stalked the highways and byways of this desolate countryside, waylaying coaches and solitary travellers and taking their food and valuables by force.
In this time period, all across the country, such attacks were common enough that few travellers set forth unarmed. Anyone making a successful career as a bandit would be no stranger to fighting and killing for their loot, and Sawney threw himself wholeheartedly into the business of indiscriminate murder. He developed a policy of leaving no survivors. Dead men, after all, tell no tales. Time passed, and Sawney Bean and his lover withdrew entirely from the world of civilization. If the townspeople of the nearby villages ever knew of their presence, they were forgotten, or were assumed to have moved on. Travellers continued to disappear, but this was, after all, a wild place and a wild time. A land of hardship and violence where life was cheaper and often much shorter than it is today, so their activities did not immediately draw much attention. But as the years went on, the toll of the missing grew into the hundreds, and eventually, gruesome evidence began to surface that something more sinister was at work than wolves or passing thieves. Girvan Beach, a few miles north of Benane Head, home to beautiful sands, a quaint harbour, and views across to the islands of Arran and Ailsa Craig. On a clear day you can even see the coast of Northern Ireland. But, so the story goes, sometime in the late 15th century, after a big storm, you might have been treated to a rather less idyllic scene. Whenever the storm tides receded, the sands would be littered with human body parts, limbs, torsos, skulls, and rather than simply decomposing, many of the skeletal remains showed signs of having been stripped of the skin and muscle tissue, like the slaughtered carcasses of animals. It's almost enough to put you off your ice cream.
Despite this, searches by the local authorities turned up nothing, and so for several more years, the sinister objects washing up on Girvan's beaches remained a disturbing mystery. Then one summer, a travelling fair came to Galloway. People from miles around flocked to visit it. And so one evening, a young couple whose names are not recorded happened to be travelling home along a small deserted lane not far from Benane Head. As twilight settled around them, they were ambushed, not by a highwayman or a band of brigands, but by a ravening horde of savages.
An 18th century account of what followed can be found in one edition of the Newgate Calendar, a series of biographical publications about notorious criminals, a sort of true crime magazine of its day.
The man, to save himself as well as he could, fought very bravely against them with sword and pistol, riding some of them down by main force of his horse. In the conflict, the poor woman fell from behind him and was instantly murdered before her husband's face, for the female cannibals cut her throat and fell to sucking her blood with as great a gust as if it had been wine. This done, they ripped up her belly and pulled out all her entrails. Such a dreadful spectacle made the man make the more obstinate resistance, as expecting the same fate if he fell into their hands. It pleased Providence, while he was thus engaged, that 20 or 30 from the same fair came together in a body, upon which Sawney Bean and his bloodthirsty clan withdrew, and made the best of their way towards a thick wood to their den. This man, who was the first that had ever fallen in their way and come off alive, told the whole company what had happened, and showed them the horrid spectacle of his wife, whom the murderers had dragged to some distance, but had not time to carry her entirely off. They, who were all struck with stupefaction and amazement at what he related, took him with them to Glasgow, and told the affair to the provost of that city, who immediately sent to the king concerning it.
Most versions of the tale conclude with the king himself, most likely King James I of Scotland, riding from Edinburgh at the head of 400 men to uproot the evil that had taken seed at Benane. The Bean's only survivor served as the guide, along with a pack of bloodhounds. At first they found nothing, and almost missed the entrance, but then the hounds sniffed out the mouth of a cave, partly hidden in the cliffside. The soldiers charged in, and the horrors they found would become the stuff of legend.
Legs, arms, hands, thighs, and feet hung up in rows like dried beef. Barrels of pickled limbs lined the walls. Gold, silver jewellery, the possessions of their victims, littered the floor. And then there was the family.
At the time of capture, the family of cannibals that inhabited this cave numbered 48. Sawney Bean, Black Agnes, 14 children and 32 grandchildren, each one the product of incest. Down here, over 25 years in the primordial darkness of the earth, amidst the smell of freshly butchered meat, the seed of a civilized man had degenerated into something no longer human.
In the most common account of the clan's destruction, the king's men rounded up the cannibals and had them transported to Edinburgh, where they were found too subhuman to stand trial. The men were castrated, their genitals were thrown into a fire, their hands and limbs were cut off and they were left on the scaffold to bleed to death. The womenfolk were forced to watch this before being burned at the stake. Another version holds that the king was so disgusted and disturbed by what he saw in the cave that he ordered his men to dynamite the entrance then and there, sealing 48 cannibals, men, women and children, into the dark belly of the cliffside that they called their home, to starve or suffocate in darkness. You almost wonder who you're supposed to be rooting for.
This, at least, is the legend. But how much of it, if any, is true?
It's tough to separate fact from fiction in this case. The tale of Sawney Bean is just so tied up in tourist bait and bogeyman stories and folklore. While some historians believe that there may be a grain of truth to the tale, most are sceptical, pointing to the fact that there's just no evidence for thousands of disappearances along the Galloway coast in this period, and likewise, nothing to corroborate these spectacular mass executions in Edinburgh of the Bean clan. One scholarly theory actually posits that Daniel Defoe, of all people, concocted the Sawney Bean story as a kind of anti-Scottish blood libel during the Jacobean conflict in an attempt to label Scots as layabouts and savages. But whatever the truth, there is no denying the cultural impact of the story.
That cultural impact goes far beyond just the scary bedtime stories most Scottish children grow up hearing, beyond even the Sawney Bean haunted boat ride at the Edinburgh Dungeon. Even if you'd never heard the name Sawney Bean until now, you've probably seen a movie based on the legend without even knowing it. Wes Craven's film The Hills Have Eyes, for example, is a full-on American retelling of the myth, as are its sequels and remakes.
You can still find strands of Sawney Bean's DNA in films such as Wrong Turn, Deliverance, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in video games like The Forest, basically anything where you have these hordes of rampaging rednecks cannibalizing and raping their way across the countryside. And, you know, it's become almost a kind of stock character in the horror genre. And that can trace its way right back to this story, to the story of Sawney Bean. So you could almost say that, in a way, Sawney Bean is the original Leatherface. And he's a local boy. I'm so proud. So what do you guys think? Is there a grain of truth to this story, or is it all just a load of bunk? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Ghastly Tales for more true horrors, short films and fiction narrations. Thanks for watching. Stay off the back roads.
We hope you've enjoyed this grisly tale from Scotland's past. While we prepare to bring you another, feel free to peruse the Ghastly Tales archive. But be careful how deep you delve.